The mahogany doors of the executive boardroom slammed open so violently that the crystal water glasses rattled. "Step away from the table! Ember!" Victor Halden's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. "Your methods are outdated. You're done here. Effective immediately." The words hit like a physical blow. I froze mid-sentence, my presentation still glowing on the 8-foot screen behind me. 13 CEOs, each controlling a slice of the $2.9 billion security network we had spent 2 years negotiating, stared at me. Some blinked. Others leaned back, as if waiting for me to protest. I didn't. Not yet. I am Ember Crosswell, Chief Systems Architect for the Halden Grieve Global Grid. For 27 years, I've built and safeguarded critical infrastructure for 9 nations: energy grids, hospitals, air traffic control, high-speed rail. My signature designs had never been breached, never failed. I was the one who made sure the system worked when every other safeguard had collapsed, and now I was being erased in front of the very leaders who depended on me. Victor Halden had been CEO for barely 6 months, young, camera-ready, and obsessed with stock value. He'd never written a line of code or stayed up until dawn patching a crisis in a war zone. His strengths were deals, headlines, and pushing people out of the way when the cameras rolled. Mine were quiet, exacting, and invisible to most, until something broke. Today, we were minutes from activating the multi-signature key network that would unify 9 countries' critical systems. Each CEO at this table held a digital key. The final, master key was mine, by design, by contract, by necessity. Without it, nothing would run. Victor knew that. The tension in the room was thick, the silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the server rack in the corner. My laptop still displayed the final activation sequence, its cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Victor stepped further in, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. "You've served your purpose," he said, glancing at the CEOs as though they'd already agreed. "We'll proceed without her." From the far end of the table, Aidan Core, CEO of Westsphere Technologies, shifted in his seat. His expression didn't change, but his right hand lifted, fingers tapping the tabletop in a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3. A signal. To me, I met his eyes for the briefest moment. And in that look, I knew the game wasn't over, not yet. Victor's voice still echoed in my head as the boardroom doors closed behind me. I walked the long marble corridor toward the lobby, each click of my heels a deliberate beat. It wasn't the pace of defeat, it was the pace of someone calculating her next move. I am Ember Crosswell, 52 years old, Chief Systems Architect for the Halden Grieve Global Grid. For nearly 3 decades, I've been the silent guardian of systems most people never think about until they fail. Energy grids that keep surgical wards alive. Flight control towers guiding planes through lightning. High-speed rail lines connecting 9 nations. The project we had been finalizing was not just another contract. It was the crown jewel of my career. A multi-signature key network designed to unite and secure the infrastructure of those nations. 13 CEOs sat at that table, each holding a digital key tied to their authority. But the final, immutable master key, that was mine, by design, by contract, by necessity, without my authorization. The network would remain locked in permanent standby. This wasn't a flaw. It was the safeguard I'd built in from the start. Years ago, when the concept was just a sketch, the original stakeholders had signed off on it, most without realizing just how absolute it was. Victor Halden hated that safeguard. 6 months into his tenure as CEO, Victor wore the role like a tailored suit he hadn't earned. Photogenic, fluent in sound bites, praised by business magazines as a visionary. He'd never written a line of code or stayed up through the night fixing a failing system. His strengths were deals, cameras, and pushing aside anyone in his way. His weakness was the very thing he dismissed: deep technical knowledge. I was his opposite, deliberate, layered, built to endure, in the public eye. Victor was the face, inside the machinery. I was the heartbeat. And he had just tried to rip it out in front of 13 global power brokers. At the elevator, the brushed steel doors reflected a calm, composed face, a mask over the sharper edge beneath. My phone buzzed. One message. No name. Hold steady, I know the truth. I didn't need a signature to know it was Aidan Core, CEO of West Sphere Technologies. In the boardroom, he hadn't looked away when Victor struck. Instead, he'd tapped 3 steady beats on the table. Eyes fixed on mine, a signal I hadn't seen in years. It carried me back 15 years, to a smaller conference room in Brussels. Aidan and I were drafting the first cross-border digital defense pact. Back then, the stakes were smaller, but the principle was the same. Never build a system without an unbreakable failsafe. I had told him, if you give away your only key, you give away your leverage. We'd written a clause together that day. In the absence of the original architect's master key, all operations shall remain suspended in perpetuity. Only 2 people had ever read it before it was buried in the legal framework: the architect and the co-signing witness. Aidan knew exactly what it meant. Now, 15 years later, he still remembered. And he knew Victor, for all his swagger, had just crippled himself without realizing it. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, the mirrored walls catching my reflection, sharper now, more defined. I adjusted my jacket, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors close. Victor thought he had humiliated me, stripped my authority, and cleared his path to take the grid as his victory. What he didn't realize was that he'd stepped into a trap I'd set before he even arrived at this company. The master key wasn't just code. It was the decision over whether the $2.9 billion deal lived or died. And in my world, leverage was everything. The elevator hummed downward. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my breathing even, my pulse steady. I wasn't walking away from the fight. I was walking toward it. I hadn't even reached the far end of the lobby when the next blow landed. Not from Victor directly this time, but from his carefully placed messengers. Caroline Voss, the company's PR manager, intercepted me in front of the elevator bank. She held a tablet in one hand, her stylus hovering awkwardly over the screen. "Ember," she began, shifting her weight from one heel to the other. "Victor asked me to make sure you know your name's been removed from the guest list for the signing ceremony this afternoon." Her tone was soft, as though that would make it sting less. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I glanced at the tablet she was holding. The digital seating chart for the media event was still open, a neat grid of names and titles under the bold header: Global Grid Launch, Signing Ceremony. Where my name had been, there was now a blank cell. No strike-through, no notation, just gone. I had been erased, cleanly, as if I'd never been part of the project. "Victor thought it might be confusing for the press," Caroline added, her voice trailing off. "Since, you know, the transition. The transition. That was his polite term for pushing me out in front of 13 CEOs and then pretending it was part of a long-term plan." I nodded once, my expression neutral. Inside, something hot and sharp twisted in my chest. I could still hear his voice from the boardroom an hour earlier, loud enough for the media liaison and every executive assistant in the hallway to hear. "We need leaders who can handle modern systems, not relics from another era." Relic. He'd chosen that word carefully, knowing exactly how it would land. It wasn't about skill. It was about perception, to the cameras. I was now the outdated veteran being replaced by fresh, innovative leadership. I kept my face still, but my jaw tightened. Anger wasn't foreign to me, but in my world, it was never loud. Loud got you caught. Quiet was where the power lived. "Noted," I told Caroline, stepping past her toward the main doors. Outside, the winter air hit me like a sheet of ice, cooling the flush in my cheeks. Across the plaza, a temporary stage was being erected for the signing ceremony. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table draped in white. Microphones lined up like sentinels. Victor would sit at the center. The 13 CEOs would flank him. Cameras would flash. Headlines would praise the visionary deal. And no one watching would know that the network couldn't launch without the master key I still held. That was fine. Let him have his picture. I started walking toward the street, my scarf pulled tight against the wind. Each step gave me more distance from the sting of his words, but not from the memory. Humiliation was a tricky thing. It burned when it landed, but it also lit the slow fuse of resolve. In my mind, I replayed the sequence in the boardroom, his calculated smirk, the way he'd looked to the CEOs as if inviting their agreement, the satisfaction in his voice when he delivered the line. This wasn't just about removing me from the project. It was about dismantling the credibility I'd built over decades. And yet, beneath that, I recognized something else: fear. He feared what he couldn't control, and I was the one piece on his board that refused to move according to his plan. A bus rumbled past, its windows reflecting the stage setup behind me. I caught a glimpse of Caroline speaking to a man in a headset, probably the event coordinator, her finger tracing over the seating chart again. It didn't matter. I wouldn't be sitting in one of those chairs. My place wasn't in front of the cameras anymore. My place was behind the scenes, where the real control existed. The humiliation lingered. Yes. The anger burned. Yes. But both were fuel. And when the moment came, I would decide how this story ended. 2 uniformed security officers stood at the end of the executive corridor, positioned like bookends around the lobby entrance. They weren't blocking the way, but their presence was unmistakable. Victor wanted my exit to be seen, remembered, and talked about. "Ms. Crosswell," the taller one said, polite but firm, "we've been instructed to escort you to the front entrance." A public removal, of course. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me bristle. My coat was already draped over my arm. I slid it on with a smooth motion, adjusted the collar, and nodded. "Lead the way." My heels clicked against the marble floor as I moved forward, each step measured, my shoulders square. I wasn't walking out like someone fired. I was walking out like someone choosing to leave. As we passed the wall of glass that lined the boardroom, I caught movement inside. Several of the 13 CEOs had shifted toward the windows, their conversations stilled. Some avoided my eyes, suddenly fascinated by their notes. Others met my gaze with expressions they quickly masked: surprise, discomfort, maybe even regret. I offered no acknowledgement, no change in stride. In corporate war, the first one to flinch loses. The shorter officer kept half a pace ahead of me. The taller stayed just behind my left shoulder. We moved into the main lobby, where staff from multiple departments were mid-conversation. Coffee cups in hand, conversations faltered as we passed. Heads turned. I kept my chin level, my expression neutral. The narrative they'd remember would be the one I left them with. And I intended for it to be calm, composed, untouchable. Near the security desk, a receptionist straightened in her chair as I passed, her eyes flicking from me to the 2 officers. She opened her mouth like she might say something, then thought better of it. We approached the revolving glass doors. Cold daylight spilled across the floor, washing over the polished marble in pale winter tones. The taller officer moved ahead to hold the outer door. But just before I stepped through, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from view. One message, no sender name. "Hold steady, I know the truth. Aiden Core." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. He hadn't looked away when Victor ambushed me in the boardroom. He hadn't joined the others in a feigned neutrality. And now, Here was my confirmation. Someone at that table understood exactly what Victor had done, and exactly what it meant for the deal. I didn't reply. Not yet. The message wasn't a conversation, it was a chess move. Outside. The winter air hit my face like a sheet of ice, clearing the stale heat of the lobby from my lungs. The plaza stretched out before me, its stone tiles slick with frost. Across the street. The skeletal frame of the signing ceremony stage stood against the pale sky. Workers in heavy coats adjusted lighting rigs and tested microphones, preparing for the photographs Victor craved. He could have his stage. For now. I paused on the top step of the plaza, letting the wind lift the edge of my scarf. My phone was still in my hand, Aiden's words glowing on the screen. Hold steady, I would. In chess. The most decisive move isn't always in advance, it's holding position until your opponent overcommits. Victor had moved too soon, too confidently. My next move would not be rushed. I slid the phone back into my pocket, descended the plaza steps, and merged into the rhythm of the city street. My pace was unbroken, my back straight, from the outside. It might look like I was leaving, but Victor hadn't realized the truth yet. I was still very much in the game, back upstairs. The boardroom was sealed again. Victor had reclaimed the head of the table, his posture confident. His tone clipped as he pushed the meeting forward. All right, let's proceed with the activation, he said. Glancing toward the screen, where the digital countdown clock glowed in bold red numbers. 18 minutes and 42 seconds. The clause was simple. If the system wasn't fully activated by 4:00 p.m., the contract would be void. It had been written to keep all parties on schedule during negotiations. But with me gone, and my master key absent, the deadline had become something else entirely. A noose Victor was tightening around his own neck. The 13 CEOs exchanged glances, but most complied when the assistants passed out the sleek, encrypted tablets. Each device displayed a large green authorize button, tied to the individual's digital key. The activation process was designed to be simultaneous. Each CEO would tap authorize in sequence, their keys combining to unlock the network. The final signature, the master key, was supposed to seal the launch. Victor leaned back slightly, clasping his hands. We'll run this smoothly, no interruptions, he told them, as though his own will could compensate for the missing piece. The timer read 12 minutes and 56 seconds. I imagined it from my vantage point now, standing on the opposite side of the plaza, partially obscured by the skeletal frame of the signing ceremony stage. The wind carried faint echoes from the conference floor above, though I couldn't make out words. It didn't matter. I knew the sequence by heart. Victor would start with a short preamble about innovation and global cooperation. The CEOs would nod, some more invested than others. At his cue, they'd tap their screens. Lights on the secure servers would blink in the corner of the boardroom, a visual confirmation for the tech observers. Then the system would reach for the final authentication. Mine. The timer dropped to 4 minutes and 11 seconds. My phone vibrated. No message this time, just the subtle hum of an internal monitoring alert I'd built into my personal systems. The grid was attempting to initiate. I checked my watch. Less than 4 minutes left. Inside the boardroom. The CTO stand-in would be leaning forward now, waiting for the master key handshake. Except it wouldn't come. My code was clear, without my biometric confirmation. The sequence would cycle twice, then terminate. The timer flashed 58 seconds. Victor's voice, in my mind, would still be calm. He'd think there was a small delay, a minor handshake hiccup. He'd glance at the CTO, expecting a nod. Instead, there would be confusion, fingers flying over keyboards, a murmur passing down the table. Then, at 0 seconds, the screen would shift. No green confirmation banners. No activation complete. Instead, across every device in the room, in every linked control hub across 9 nations. The same message would appear in stark white text against a black background. Authentication failed. Contact Master Architect. I could almost see it. The sudden stillness. The uncomfortable weight of realization settling over the table. Quiet satisfaction warmed me in the cold air of the plaza. The system was doing exactly what it was built to do: protect itself from interference, from shortcuts, from people like Victor, who thought they could override the architecture without understanding it. Across the street, a cluster of media techs ran cables along the curb, prepping for the ceremony that now had no system to celebrate. Somewhere inside, Victor would be scrambling to contain the optics, to keep the CEOs from asking the obvious question, why is the master architect no longer here? I turned from the stage construction, my scarf whipping lightly in the wind, and began walking toward the coffee shop on the corner. No need to rush. The clock had already run out, and the failure was spreading through the network in real time. The message on every screen was my unspoken presence in the room, a reminder they could erase me from the guest list. But not from the system itself. And this was only the beginning. The lobby of the Halden Grieve Tower always smelled faintly of polished wood and espresso. I sat at a small marble-top table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a cup of coffee in my hands. Outside, the late afternoon light washed the city in muted gold. But inside, the air was tense, charged with the echo of what had just happened upstairs. I'd ordered the coffee less for the caffeine and more to have a reason to sit still. Movement draws attention. Stillness lets you observe. From here, I could see employees passing through the revolving doors, their glances sliding in my direction before quickly darting away. News travels fast in a corporate tower, and the way they avoided eye contact told me the rumors were already spreading. My phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number. I hesitated only a moment before answering. "Ember," the voice on the other end said, low and steady. "Aiden Core." "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon," I said. "I don't have much time," he replied. I could hear voices in the background, muffled, agitated, layered over the faint hum of an elevator. "The room is in chaos. The other CEOs are furious. Not one of them knew you were being removed before activation." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness roll over my tongue. Victor didn't brief them? Not a word. What? He tried to gloss over it with some nonsense about streamlining decision-making. They're not buying it. Not after what just happened with the system. I pictured the scene upstairs. 13 executives, each with their own stake in a multi-billion-dollar network, suddenly realizing the linchpin had been yanked without their knowledge. The image was satisfying, but more importantly, it was leverage. "What's the temperature in the room now?" I asked. Aiden exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp over the line. "They're asking questions about you, about the master key, about why the system is architected the way it is. Some of them remember what you told them when this all started. And some of them, they're connecting the dots for the first time." My fingers curled loosely around the warm ceramic cup. "And you?" "I know exactly what happened," he said. Then his voice dropped half a register. "Do you remember Brussels? 15 years ago." A memory stirred immediately. Long conference tables, thick binders, the smell of strong European coffee at dawn. Negotiations for the first cross-border digital defense pact. "You told me," he continued, "never give away your only key." I let the silence between us stretch, savoring the weight of those words. "That advice," he said, "is why you still have control now, and why Victor's about to find out just how bad a move he made. Trust, not blind, not naive, but earned over years and reinforced in moments like this." Aiden wasn't calling to reminisce. He was signaling alignment. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "For now, Nothing. Sit tight. Let the frustration simmer. They'll come to you, and when they do, you decide the terms. I glanced toward the security desk, where the guards from earlier stood talking quietly. My departure had been intended as a show of weakness, but now, with the network stalled and the board questioning Victor's judgment, my absence was the loudest statement I could have made. "All right," I said finally. "I'll hold position." "I'll be in touch," he replied, and the line went dead. I set the phone down beside my coffee and looked out the window. Across the street, the signing ceremony stage was still being assembled, as if nothing had changed. But the reality was already shifting. The system failure had cracked the veneer of Victor's control. And through that crack, opportunity was spilling in. I lifted the cup again, the coffee now lukewarm, and took another sip. The bitterness didn't bother me. Some flavors are better when they linger. From my seat in the corner of the coffee shop, I could see the top floors of the Halden Grieve Tower through the wide glass windows. The light from the boardroom level burned bright against the dusky sky. I had left the building hours earlier, but in my mind, I could still feel the pulse of its servers, the rhythm of the network I had built. My phone vibrated on the table. It wasn't a call or a message, just a discreet alert from one of my private monitoring channels, a system I'd kept separate from company infrastructure. The signal was clear. A master key sequence was being attempted from inside the grid. So Victor wasn't wasting time. I pulled the laptop from my bag and opened it. The familiar interface glowing on the screen. The secure overlay showed an internal access attempt marked with the company's authentication header, but the signature string wasn't mine. It was something new, hastily generated. They were trying to fake me, for the first time since this all began. A knot tightened in my stomach. Victor had resources. If his engineers had gotten close enough to replicate my key, the system might accept it, at least temporarily. That could buy him enough time to bring the network online, claim victory, and rewrite the story before I had the chance to act. I watched the trace logs scroll. Whoever was running the operation was good. They'd isolated the handshake protocol, bypassed the biometric prompt, and inserted a high-grade cryptographic token in its place. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to intervene. Then I saw it, an anomaly tucked deep in the code, a countdown marker, my own marker, 15 years ago, when I'd first started designing security frameworks for multinational systems. I'd built a private safeguard for scenarios exactly like this. Any unauthorized replication of my master key would trigger a hidden timer. 6 minutes after successful authentication, the fake key would self-nullify, purging itself and forcing the system back into standby. The engineers upstairs didn't know it yet, but even if they succeeded, their success would evaporate before they could celebrate. Still, 6 minutes was 6 minutes too long. In a boardroom full of high-powered executives and media-ready optics, 6 minutes of apparent victory could be enough to sway sentiment against me. The trace logs flickered. The authentication test had cleared the first round. They were 90 seconds away from full system handshake. My coffee sat untouched beside me, cooling as I tracked every line of data. For the first time, I felt my pulse match the rhythm of the scrolling code. What if they'd somehow disabled the timer? What if my safeguard failed after all these years? The thought wasn't entirely paranoid. Code degrades, systems evolve, and a determined enough team can stumble into the one weakness you never saw coming. The handshake completed. I saw the system status change. Master key authentication, success. My breath caught in my throat. On the 32nd floor, I could almost imagine the swell of relief in the boardroom. Victor leaning back in his chair with that smug half-smile. The engineers would be nodding, hands flying across keyboards to push the activation sequence through. I glanced at my watch. 5 minutes and 59 seconds. The timer was running. For the next 5 minutes. My screen showed the grid humming to life. Control channels opening across the 9 participating nations. Lights on the network map shifted from red to green. In the eyes of anyone watching in real time, it would look as though the problem had been solved, my absence rendered irrelevant. 4 minutes, 3. My pulse slowed as the familiar confidence returned. They were inside my system, yes, but they were inside on my terms, at exactly 0 seconds. The network map blinked. Green nodes reverted to red. Control channels slammed shut. And across every active terminal, the words appeared. Master key invalidated. Session terminated. Contact master architect. In the boardroom. That had to land like a guillotine. I closed the laptop gently and reached for my coffee. The knot in my stomach loosened. Victor's desperation had gotten him close, but close wasn't enough. And he'd just learned the difference the hard way. From the coffee shop. I had watched the building's glow shift with the evening, each lit window a reminder of the negotiations still unfolding without me. The fake key attempt was over, and my safeguards had done their job. Still. The real question lingered. How long before someone in that room decided they needed me back? The answer came faster than I expected. My phone rang, this time with a name instead of unknown. Aiden Core. They're calling another meeting, he said without preamble. Now, full board. I leaned back in my chair. And I've just made it very clear to Victor that this conversation doesn't happen without you in the room. Siu. Through the faint static, I could hear the low murmur of voices, some sharp, some incredulous. The energy was different from before. It wasn't just frustration now, it was challenge. What changed? I asked. The activation failure didn't vanish with your exit, Aiden replied. And the attempted workaround, let's just say it didn't exactly inspire confidence. I could almost smile at that. They're starting to connect the dots? They're not just connecting them, they're drawing them in permanent ink. His voice dropped slightly. You'll want to hear this part. Cho Kyung-min, CEO of Eastern Transit Group. She just told the room she won't sign a single page until you're sitting across the table from her. Said the grid without its architect isn't worth the paper it's written on. The image landed like a spark in dry tinder. Cho was known for her meticulous, risk-averse approach. If she was drawing a line that clearly, others would follow. Aiden's voice cut back in. Victor's trying to keep control, but it's slipping, fast. I stood, tossing a few bills on the table for my untouched coffee. Send me the invite. Already on your way, he said, and hung up. By the time I stepped back into the Halden Grieve Tower, the executive floor was humming. Assistants moved quickly between offices, whispering into headsets. The double doors to the boardroom were closed, but I could hear the edge in the voices inside. The guard at the door gave me a wary look. They're expecting you, he said after a moment, pushing the handle. Inside. The air was thick with tension. Victor stood near the head of the table, his jaw tight, his hands braced on the back of his chair. The 13 CEOs were seated, their attention fractured between him and the stack of documents at the center of the table. And then I saw it, slightly worn at the edges. The ink a shade lighter than fresh print. A copy of the original grid contract. I stepped closer, scanning the familiar formatting. The signatures lined neatly along the final page. All 13, plus mine. And there, buried halfway through the legalese, the clause Aiden and I had written 15 years ago. In the absence of the original architect's master key, all operations shall remain suspended in perpetuity. No edits, no amendments. Exactly as it had been signed. The hope I'd been holding in check edged upward. This wasn't just leverage, it was the foundation of my authority. In black and white, right in front of everyone, Cho Kyung-min sat 2 seats from the left, her posture straight, her gaze steady on me. If she's not part of this deal, she said, her voice calm but unyielding. I'm out, and I suspect I'm not alone. A low ripple moved through the room. 2 other CEOs nodded almost immediately. Another leaned back, folding his arms. Victor's mouth opened, then closed, his grip on the chair tightening. I let the moment stretch, my eyes sweeping the table. Hope wasn't just a feeling now. It was a tangible shift in the air, a rebalancing of the scales. When I finally took my seat, I didn't need to say a word. The contract spoke for me. The room didn't quiet instantly when I stepped inside. It froze. The kind of stillness that comes when people are caught between what they thought was true and what they're now seeing. Victor was still standing at the head of the table, his hands on the back of his chair. But his shoulders shifted slightly, a reflexive tightening. His voice, halfway through a sentence, faltered before he caught it again. I didn't rush. My heels clicked steadily against the polished floor. Each step deliberate. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to reclaim my seat. Aiden nodded once from his place halfway down the table, a silent acknowledgement that this was my moment to control. Several of the other CEOs leaned subtly forward, their attention narrowing on me, as if to confirm I was more than the rumor Victor had been spinning. I stopped at the empty chair directly across from Victor, the one that had been mine for years. Without asking, without looking for permission, I pulled it out and sat. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable for me. It was mine. Quiet was where the real power lived. I folded my hands on the table and let my gaze travel the room. Before we move any further toward activation, I said evenly, there's something you all should read. From my bag, I withdrew a document sleeve and slid it toward the center. Inside was my own preserved copy of the original grid contract, identical to the one on the table, but with one section marked in yellow. Aiden was the first to reach for it, flipping directly to the highlighted clause. He read it aloud, his voice calm but carrying across the room. In the absence of the original architect's master key, all operations shall remain suspended in perpetuity. Furthermore, any change in personnel in the position of Chief Systems Architect prior to activation shall render the agreement void in its entirety. I let the words settle into the air like a weight on a balance scale. This isn't a suggestion, I said. It's a binding term, signed by every party at this table. It was written to protect the integrity of the network and the trust between nations by ensuring that the person who built it is present to see it activated. Cho Kyung-min gave a small, satisfied nod. Two others murmured in agreement across the table. Another CEO rested his pen on the paper, the kind of small gesture that says he's already decided his position. Victor's jaw flexed. You're implying this entire deal collapses without you? I'm not implying anything, I replied, my tone as level as the surface of the table. I'm reading the terms you signed. Silence pressed in again, but this time it didn't feel frozen. It felt aligned. The weight of the clause had shifted the dynamic in the room. I could see it in the way eyes were turning toward each other instead of toward Victor, in the quiet tapping of fingers on leather chair arms as decisions were being made. I leaned back slightly. Not as a retreat, but as a signal. I wasn't here to plead or posture. My role was already defined in ink, in the legal framework holding this entire project together. This network was built to last decades, I said. You don't gamble with that kind of stability for short-term optics. Aiden closed the folder and slid it back toward me. Then it seems, he said, looking down the table, we know what needs to happen next. No one contradicted him, for the first time since Victor had tried to erase me. I felt the shift solidify. Quietly, without shouting, without spectacle, the power had returned to its rightful place. To me, the air in the boardroom felt like a stretched wire ready to snap. Moments ago, I had finished reading the clause that froze the contract in its tracks. The silence afterward had been thick, unsettling for them, grounding for me. But Victor wasn't one to let silence linger. He rose from his seat, face taut, phone already in hand. If you all want this deal alive, he said, voice tight. You'll hear from someone who actually controls the future of this company. I didn't need to ask who. The largest shareholder. The man Victor had always treated as his final, untouchable trump card. The one person who could bend the board without lifting his voice. He dialed, pressing the speaker button so every CEO in the room could hear the call connect. Malcolm, it's Victor. We've hit a snag, Ember's being difficult. The other CEOs are still on the fence. I need you to make it very clear to them where you stand. I leaned back slightly in my chair, calm but alert. Every eye in the room bounced between Victor and me, as if bracing for the impact of whatever was about to come through that phone. A brief crackle, then Malcolm's voice, deep, deliberate. Victor, he said slowly, I was hoping you'd call. There was a shift in the air. Malcolm didn't sound eager to defend him. Victor smiled faintly. Assuming control. Good. Because this is simple. These contracts need signatures today. If Ember won't cooperate, we move forward without her. I trust you'll make that clear to our indecisive partners. A pause. Long enough for Victor's smirk to falter. Victor, Malcolm began again, his tone heavier now. I don't own the influence you're counting on. The room went still. Victor blinked. What do you mean you don't own? I sold most of my shares last week, Malcolm said. To Aiden. The words hit like a controlled detonation. My gaze flicked toward Aiden, who was seated 2 chairs away, entirely composed, his hands folded neatly on the table. You... what? Victor's voice cracked, something I had never heard from him before. Malcolm's tone didn't waver. Victor, you've made decisions that put the company at risk. Aiden made me an offer I found reassuring. The deal's done. My voting power isn't yours to wield anymore. Several CEOs exchanged looks. A few leaned back in their chairs, their tension melting into quiet satisfaction. Victor's color drained. You're telling me, right now, while I'm in the middle of salvaging this... Malcolm cut him off. Sharp. No. Victor, you're in the middle of watching consequences arrive, and frankly, you've earned every one of them. The line clicked dead. For a moment. The only sound in the room was Victor's unsteady breath. His hand, still clutching the phone, trembled slightly. He looked from one CEO to another, searching for support, finding none. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence now belonged to me. Aiden broke it instead, his voice low but caring. With Malcolm's shares transferred, I now hold the controlling interest, which means... He glanced my way. A subtle nod. This meeting continues with Ember's terms on the table. The weight of the moment settled over Victor like a final verdict. His jaw tightened, but his fight was gone. Shall we proceed? I asked, my tone steady, unhurried. One by one. The CEOs nodded. Pens moved across paper. Pages slid toward me for confirmation. And in the space between heartbeats, I felt the power shift, not loud or dramatic, but complete. Victor sat back, eyes unfocused, no longer in command. The deal wasn't just back in motion, it was mine to define now. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself imagine the outcome, not as survival, but as victory, when the voting began. The air inside the boardroom felt heavier than any meeting I had ever been in. Not one voice raised, not a chair scraped, just the deliberate, weighted sound of pens clicking and papers shifting. For months, my name had been whispered only as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when you crossed Victor Halden. Now, it was written clearly on every ballot. The first CEO slid his paper forward. Terminate partnership with Halden Grieve. His tone carried no apology, no hesitation, just a finality that sent a quiet ripple across the table. One by one. The others followed. 8, 9, 10. The momentum was building, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something I'd thought I'd lost for good. Control. Aiden stood at the far end, his presence calm but unmistakably decisive. "Gentlemen and ladies," he said evenly, "you're voting not just to end a contract, but to set a precedent. That precedent is that people, real people, who build these systems matter." He let the sentence linger, glancing toward me. "We don't replace trust with arrogance." By the 12th vote, the outcome was irreversible. The partnership with Haldengreve was over. But Aiden wasn't done. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a new document. Its pages thick, its binding crisp. The ink so fresh, it still reflected light from the overhead fixtures. "This," he said, placing it in the center of the table, "is the consortium agreement you will sign instead, and it names Ember Calloway as Chief Systems Architect, effective immediately." My throat tightened. The title wasn't just a job, it was a return of identity. The acknowledgement that my work and my place still belonged here. The CEOs passed the document around, scanning, nodding, when it reached me. I hesitated for half a second before placing my pen to the paper. My signature looked steady, but my pulse was anything but. As the last signature was added, Aiden leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "I've been preparing this for 18 months, he said, "waiting for Victor to make a mistake big enough to expose himself. I knew when he pushed you out. It was the moment." The realization hit harder than I expected. All the months of feeling isolated hadn't been as solitary as I'd believed. Someone had been watching, not as a bystander, but as an ally with the patience to strike when it counted. Victor's chair sat empty, the embossed leather untouched since he'd stormed out. In its place, the space felt symbolic, like the absence of power itself. "I need to be clear," I said, my voice carrying across the table. "This isn't just about me. The clause that protected my license should exist for every architect, every lead developer, every engineer who creates something irreplaceable. No one should be erased just because it's convenient." A few of the CEOs exchanged glances. One nodded slowly, making a note in the margin of his copy. Another said, "We can build that into the consortium's charter." It was the first time since this ordeal began that I allowed myself to breathe fully. The sharp edge of survival mode began to dull, replaced by something steadier, recognition. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered for a moment at the long table. My hands brushed over the smooth grain of the wood, the faint indentations where signatures had pressed deep. Aiden caught my eye. "Ready to get back to work?" I smiled, small, but real. "More than you know." Outside the glass doors, the corridor felt different. The same walls, the same muted carpet. But I walked through it carrying something Victor could never touch. Liberation wasn't loud. It was the quiet satisfaction of seeing the people who underestimated you rewrite the rules with your name in them. Recognition wasn't a title on a desk plate. It was every nod, every handshake, every line in a contract that acknowledged exactly what you'd built. And as I stepped into the elevator, I realized this wasn't the end of the fight. It was the first day I'd be fighting from a place of power. The low hum of servers was the first sound that greeted me as I stepped into the new operations center. The glass walls curved in a perfect arc, revealing a panoramic map stretched across the main display. 9 countries. Their outlines traced in gold, and one by one, their icons pulsed green. It was the signal I had been waiting for. The room wasn't just full of engineers, it was full of people who had chosen to be here. People who had watched the chaos at Haldengreve unfold, who had seen the vote swing toward Aiden's consortium, and who had made a deliberate choice to follow us. My chest tightened, not with anxiety, but with something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months, pride without fear. Aiden stood a few feet away, speaking with the new regional leads. He caught my eye, and the brief nod we exchanged was heavy with unspoken history. In that nod was every closed-door meeting, every clause we'd fought to protect, Every time I'd swallowed my own defense until the moment was right. I walked toward the main console. The screen's glow washed over my hands as I touched the control pad, bringing up the system's core schematic. Every link was stable, every security layer intact. I could almost hear the hum of interconnected trust. Trust in code, in process, in the people running it. Behind me, an applause rose from the monitoring team as the final 2 countries lit up. Full activation, no backdoors, no sabotage, no signatures missing. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt the weight lift completely. Everything green, one of the analysts announced. All regions report operational readiness. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Good. That's exactly how it's going to stay. As the applause faded, Aiden walked over, his voice lower now. You've done more than rebuild, Ember. You've made it untouchable. I tilted my head slightly. Not entirely untouchable. He frowned, intrigued. What do you mean? I leaned in, keeping my tone even. There's a layer, one more than the documentation shows. It's locked to my authentication. No one else even knows it exists. If someone tries to force a personnel change like before, the system automatically drops to a secured offline mode. No damage to clients, but no continuation either. It freezes until I, or whoever I designate, reactivates it. His eyes narrowed. Not in suspicion, but in understanding. A safeguard against history repeating itself. Exactly. I let my gaze drift back to the map. We've earned this. I won't see it destroyed because someone wanted a headline or a power grab. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The screens continued their slow, steady pulse of green. I thought of the boardroom that day, the way Victor had tried to bulldoze me out of the picture, the way my name had been nearly erased from a project I had built from the ground up. And I thought of the faces here now, faces that knew I hadn't just survived. I had shaped what came next. Aiden broke the silence. You know, when I started planning this 18 months ago, I didn't know who'd be standing here with me, but I knew it had to be someone who understood the weight of building something that lasts. I gave a quiet laugh. You waited 18 months for the right person? He shook his head. I waited 18 months for you. The green light from the map reflected in the glass as I took in the sight of the new operations center. The hum, the calm, the steady assurance that no one could take this from us now. My pride wasn't just in the system, it was in the journey, in the unshakable proof that integrity, though tested, can survive. I rested my hand on the console, my reflection merging with the map in the glass. Empires fall, I said softly, my voice carrying just enough for Aiden to hear. But systems, built with integrity, endure.